What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into something that PlayStation fans have been asking Sony to figure out for what feels like forever, and that is native PS3 emulation on the PlayStation 5. Recently, reports, leaks, testing footage, and insider discussions started making the rounds online, showing PS3 games apparently running through an emulation layer on PS5 hardware. And we are not talking about tiny indie games or simple 2D titles either. We are talking about major PS3 era games including Killzone, MotorStorm, Grand Theft Auto 4, and several other demanding titles from one of the most technically complicated generations in gaming history. If Sony is genuinely making progress here, this could end up being one of the biggest developments for the PlayStation ecosystem in years, because the PS3 generation has always felt stranded compared to the rest of PlayStation history. The PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 libraries have remained fairly accessible over the years through remasters, ports, collections, and even emulation on various platforms. The PS4 naturally carried over into the PS5 generation with backwards compatibility support, but the PS3 has always existed in this awkward space where so much of its library became trapped on original hardware. If you wanted to revisit many of Sony's biggest PS3 exclusives, you needed to own a functioning PlayStation 3. Hope your discs still worked, hope your console still worked, and accept that some of those games would remain stuck at inconsistent frame rates and resolutions from nearly 2 decades ago. That has been frustrating for players for years because the PS3 era contained some of PlayStation's most ambitious and memorable exclusives, yet it also has been the hardest generation for Sony to preserve properly. The reason for that comes down to the PlayStation 3's infamous architecture. The cell processor was incredibly ambitious when Sony designed it. At the time, Sony believed the cell architecture could give developers unprecedented power, but what actually happened was many studios struggled to work with it. The PS3 became notoriously difficult to develop for during the early years of the generation. Multi-platform games often perform worse on the PS3 compared to Xbox 360 because developers had trouble utilizing the hardware efficiently. First-party studios eventually learned how to maximize the system, which is why games like Killzone 2, The Last of Us, Uncharted 2, God of War 3, and Metal Gear Solid 4 looked so incredible at the time. But all of that technical complexity also made the PS3 incredibly difficult to emulate. Even today, PS3 emulation on PC through RPCS3 requires powerful hardware for many games. Some titles run beautifully, while others still have issues depending on the game and your setup. That is what makes these PS5 emulation tests so interesting. If Sony has actually created an internal PS3 emulator capable of running these games on PS5 hardware, even imperfectly, that represents years of technical work behind the scenes. That is not something Sony could throw together overnight. Emulating the PlayStation 3 has always been considered one of the biggest technical challenges in gaming preservation. Now, before people get too excited, it is important to say that the testing footage and reports we have seen so far do not suggest perfect compatibility. This is clearly still a work in progress. Some games reportedly run surprisingly well, while others suffer from graphical glitches, crashes, audio problems, unstable frame rates, or visual artifacts. But honestly, even getting certain PS3 games to boot and become playable on native PS5 hardware is impressive considering how difficult PS3 emulation is. This is one of those situations where progress matters more than perfection right now, because for years, many people assumed Sony simply would never bother pursuing native PS3 emulation at all. And the games being tested are exactly the kinds of titles fans have wanted to access for years. Let's start with Killzone, because that series perfectly represents the PS3 problem. During the PlayStation 3 era, Killzone was one of Sony's flagship franchises. Killzone 2 especially was viewed as a technical showcase for the system with its heavy atmosphere, cinematic presentation, destructible environments, and incredible visual effects for the time. Killzone 3 continued pushing the hardware further while improving gameplay mechanics and expanding the scale of combat. Yet, despite all of that, the franchise has basically disappeared. Those games remain trapped on PS3 hardware with no modern remastered collection available on PS5 or PC. Unless you still own a PS3, there is no easy official way to revisit one of Sony's most important first-party shooters from that generation. MotorStorm is another massive example. Honestly, the MotorStorm series deserves far more recognition than it gets today because it was one of the most chaotic and visually impressive arcade racing franchises of its era. The original MotorStorm showed off the PS3's graphical capabilities with mud physics, destruction, dense particle effects, and huge environmental detail. MotorStorm Pacific Rift expanded everything with more varied environments, while Apocalypse delivered one of the craziest disaster-themed racing experiences ever made. Building collapsed around you, earthquakes ripped tracks apart, and races felt like complete insanity in the best possible way. Yet Sony abandoned the franchise and never brought it forward properly. There has never really been another racing series that captured that same style of over-the-top off-road chaos. Seeing MotorStorm footage running through PS3 emulation instantly reminded people how much potential the franchise still has. Then there is Grand Theft Auto 4, which remains one of the most requested games for modern PlayStation backwards compatibility. GTA 4 may not have been a PlayStation exclusive, but it absolutely defined that generation. Nico Bellic remains one of Rockstar's strongest protagonists. Liberty City still feels immersive and believable, and the game's darker, grounded tone stands out even more today in a gaming industry filled with oversized open worlds. Ironically, Xbox players gained access to improved backwards compatibility support for GTA 4 years ago through Xbox One and Xbox Series X. PlayStation players never received that same treatment. If you wanted to replay GTA 4 on PlayStation hardware, you needed a PS3. That is honestly ridiculous considering how important the game was historically. So naturally, seeing GTA 4 reportedly running through PS3 emulation on PS5 generated huge excitement online. But this entire conversation goes beyond just a handful of games. The PS3 generation contains an enormous number of titles currently stranded on aging hardware. The Resistance series, the Infamous series, Puppeteer, Folklore, Heavenly Sword, Ratchet and Clank Future, 3D Dot Game Heroes, Tokyo Jungle, Little Big Planet, Metal Gear Solid 4, and countless others remain difficult or impossible to access on modern PlayStation systems. Many of these games were major parts of PlayStation history. Some were critically acclaimed, some became cult classics, some experimented with gameplay ideas that modern AAA gaming rarely attempts anymore. Yet many younger players have never experienced them simply because Sony has struggled to preserve the PS3 library. This is why this situation matters so much. Backwards compatibility is no longer just a bonus feature. It has become part of how players judge entire ecosystems. Microsoft understood that years ago. Xbox invested heavily into backwards compatibility and game preservation throughout the Xbox One and Xbox Series generations. Sony has often approached backwards compatibility differently, focusing more heavily on remasters, remakes, streaming services, and selective re-releases. Sometimes that strategy works, but it also leaves huge gaps in preservation. Streaming PS3 games through PlayStation Plus Premium never fully solved the issue because streaming introduces input lag, compression artifacts, internet dependency, and inconsistent performance depending on your connection. Players have wanted true native support for years because native support preserves the experience far more effectively. And honestly, Sony needs something like this now more than ever. Gaming nostalgia has become an enormous part of the industry. Players want access to older games. They want preservation. They want libraries that carry forward across generations instead of disappearing every time new hardware launches. Nintendo has leaned heavily into nostalgia through retro libraries and remasters. Xbox has emphasized backwards compatibility and Game Pass access to older titles. Sony has incredible gaming history, but much of its PS3 legacy remains inaccessible compared to competitors. Native PS3 emulation on PS5 could help close that gap significantly. We do not know how broad compatibility would be if Sony officially launches PS3 emulation publicly. They may support only a curated list of games initially. Some titles may require additional optimization work on a per-game basis. Licensing issues could create problems for certain releases, especially games with expired music contracts or licensed content. Physical disc support remains another huge question because many fans would love the ability to insert original PS3 disc directly into the PS5 and play them natively. We simply do not know if Sony intends to go that far. There is also the question of performance enhancements. One of the exciting possibilities surrounding emulation is the ability to improve games beyond their original hardware limitations. Imagine PS3 games running at stable frame rates, higher resolutions, faster loading times, improved texture filtering, and enhanced controller support through the DualSense. Games that originally struggled to maintain 30 frames per second could potentially feel dramatically smoother on modern hardware. The PS5's SSD alone could massively improve loading times in many older games. That kind of modernization would make revisiting these classics far more appealing for both longtime fans and entirely new audiences. Another important aspect here is preservation itself. Gaming has a preservation problem that the industry still has not fully solved. Movies and music generally remain accessible across generations through various formats and services, but video games frequently disappear when hardware becomes obsolete. Entire libraries risk becoming inaccessible over time. Physical disks degrade, digital storefronts shut down, hardware fails, online services disappear. Without proper preservation efforts, major parts of gaming history can effectively vanish for average consumers. The PS3 generation has always been especially vulnerable because of how difficult its architecture is to preserve through emulation. And honestly, this generation deserves preservation. The PS3 era was messy, ambitious, experimental, and incredibly creative. Developers were still figuring out HD gaming standards. Budgets were exploding. Online multiplayer was evolving rapidly. Studios were experimenting with cinematic storytelling, physics systems, motion controls, open world design, and online infrastructure in ways that felt exciting and unpredictable. Some games failed spectacularly, others became legendary, but the generation itself had personality. It felt like developers were constantly trying new things rather than chasing the same handful of formulas repeatedly. That is why people remain emotionally attached to these games. They are not just nostalgic for graphics or old hardware. They miss the feeling of that era. Games like MotorStorm, Resistance, Infamous, Little Big Planet, they all felt unique. Even flawed PS3 games often had memorable identities that stuck with players years later. Preserving those experiences matters because they represent an important chapter in gaming history. Now realistically, even if Sony officially introduces PS3 emulation on PS5, expectations should remain reasonable. This will probably not become an instant solution where every PS3 game suddenly runs flawlessly overnight. Emulation development takes time. Compatibility improves gradually. Some games will likely always present challenges because of how they were programmed originally. But even partial success would represent a major step forward for PlayStation preservation efforts. And frankly, the fact Sony appears to be seriously testing this at all is already notable. For years, many fans assumed Sony had simply given up on solving PS3 backwards compatibility natively. Streaming became the fallback solution, and that seemed like the direction the company intended to stick with permanently. But these recent developments suggest Sony may finally recognize how important the PS3 library remains to PlayStation fans. And honestly, they should. The PS3 generation helped shape modern PlayStation identity in massive ways. Ignoring that history never felt right. Now, I want to hear from all of you. If PS3 emulation launches on PS5, what games would you want to replay first? Would it be Killzone, MotorStorm, Resistance, Infamous, Metal Gear Solid 4, GTA 4, Little Big Planet? Let me know down in the comments below because honestly, there are so many PS3 games that deserve a second life on modern hardware. And if you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you do not miss any future videos. Also, check out my Patreon, where my latest Patreon exclusive is why survival games keep captivating players. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, game on.